Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Bayan Berkeley webinar. This is the 5th event in our webinar series in collaboration with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Thanks to Dr. Asad Ahmed, Director of the Center. I want to welcome all of you on behalf of Bayan and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Today, our topic will be Muslim women's scholarship in Islamic tradition and Western academia. We have two phenomenal speakers joining us today who will be speaking on this topic. Just to give you a little bit more background regarding this partnership between Bayan and Berkeley, the idea behind the collaboration is to bridge the theoretical and academic study of Islam and Muslims with praxis and application in our communities and in civil society and in the media. We are looking to find ways to explore both Western academic discourse and put it in conversation with traditional scholarly methods and discourses. And this webinar series is one part of this collaboration. We're hoping to bring our graduate students together for projects and conferences, and we want you to stay tuned for more information about this collaboration. But once again, we thank you for attending today's webinar. It's going to be an opportunity to look at women's scholarship. As we all know, women's scholarship is under-investigated, it's underappreciated and underrepresented. And although we're starting to see shifts, it would be noteworthy and worthwhile to take stock of the factors and the dynamics that are either advancing or inhibiting women's professional scholarship and their contributions in leadership as well. So we're very happy to be able to facilitate this conversation today. Our first speaker will be Juliana Hammer. Professor Hammer is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She received her MA and PhD from Humboldt University in Berlin. And her scholarly trajectory has ranged from research on Palestinian women and diaspora and return experiences, and a decade of work on American Muslim communities, intersecting with women, gender, and sexuality in contemporary Muslim contexts. She's also the co-editor of a book called Muslim Women and Gender Justice, Concepts, Sources, and Histories, and she's co-edited with Dr. Omid Safi and contributed to the Cambridge Companion on American Islam. Her latest book is titled Peaceful Families, American Muslim Efforts Against Domestic Violence, and it's published with Princeton University Press in 2019. She has a forthcoming work on patriarchal Islam, gender, sex, and love in the Muslim American public square. So these are promising and fantastic works, and hopefully we'll get elements of those works in the talk that we hear today. Dr. Mahjabeen Dhala, our second speaker, is Assistant Professor of Islamic Studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley and Director of a program called the Madrasa Midrasa Program, a collaborative effort of the Center for Islamic Studies and the Center for Jewish Studies at GTU. She received her MA in Islamic Studies from GTU and is part of the class of 2021 for her PhD from the Department of Sacred Texts and Their Interpretation. Her dissertation looks at the 7th century Sermon of Fatima to trace early Shia activist voices, especially those of women. And Dr. Dhala has received a number of awards and fellowships and grants for interreligious studies work and for collaborative Jewish-Muslim research. And prior to her matriculation at GTU, she pursued traditional Islamic seminary studies for over 7 years and has led Muslim communities worldwide for nearly 2 decades. So we have phenomenal scholars and leaders today to share their thoughts and work with us. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Juliana Hammer, and we'll listen to her first, and then we'll transition over to Dr. Dhala. Welcome, Dr. Hammer.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So I want to start by expressing gratitude for the invitation to be part of this conversation and for the opportunity to do something that we don't often do in these types of public conversations, which is to reflect with others on how we do our work. That is what I saw as the sort of the focus of the invitation. And what I want to do here is, in interesting ways, sharing something that has also been part of my work. And I will say a little bit more about why that only started happening relatively recently in my scholarly trajectory. So I'm grateful to Munir and to both institutions for this opportunity. And will say that I was really, really excited to see that anyone wants to have that conversation, because it is generally one that I think Muslim women scholars in particular have more informally rather than in that somewhat more formal setting that is also going to be available to others later. So I want to start in the beginning and situate myself a little bit. I grew up in Germany, actually in East Germany, and as Dr. Sheikh already pointed out, also got my degrees, both an MA and a PhD in Islamic Studies from Germany, from Humboldt University. And you probably all are not familiar with how the German academic system might work, but one of the issues, or one of my challenges, was that I became Muslim towards the second half of my graduate studies, and ended up feeling that I had to hide that fact until I left Germany to come to the US. And there's something specific about the history of Islamic studies in Germany that made that necessary. And it is in fact the case that even now in what we call Islamic studies, Islamwissenschaften in Germany, Muslim scholars are terribly underrepresented. When I came to the US, I approached and entered the field of Islamic studies very much as part of religious studies, which is its own topic and its own talk, as an outsider. I was an outsider to its dynamics, I was an outsider to its history, and I was very much also an outsider to its networks. So people usually in the US context, and many of you know this, establish their networks and relationships while they're in graduate school, and I didn't have access to that. But I also experienced that coming from outside as a unique opportunity to reflect and to observe in ways that someone who was trained within the system can't quite do in the same way. And with the result that, because I had to, I spent a lot of time thinking about political dynamics and the different methodological approaches, the different approaches to theory that scholars in Islamic studies as part of religious studies in the US and in the sort of North American context employ. Now, 2 decades later, and having gone through work that, as Munir already said, started with a focus on Palestinian society and Palestinian, especially Palestinian return experiences, to a move that I made early after I moved to the US to focus on US Muslims. I came to my interest in US Muslims, US Muslim communities, with an already established interest in gender studies. The sexuality studies piece has come later and is also still relatively recent. But if I look back at the 2 decades of work that I have done in the US context, I would describe it something like this. And that's not how I describe my work in my bio, but it's been really helpful for me to think about it in these ways, which is that I study systems of oppression such as colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and anti-Muslim hostility in their specific impact on Muslims. Step 1, usually step 1. And step 2, I'm also equally interested in Muslim efforts at resistance, community building, and knowledge production, as well as activism that are working to change the world. So at the center of my work, and this is something that I wouldn't have formulated quite in that way, say a decade ago, is both to think about justice and injustice and to do work that changes the world toward in the direction of justice. And I wrote down here that I want to say very explicitly something that is difficult to say in the public university context that I teach in, which is that I see justice as a divine value, and that commitment to justice work comes out of my religious ethics. So I currently teach in a public university. I've been at UNC for almost a decade now, but I've spent most of the 20 years that I've been in the US in public institutions and a couple of private ones, but even the private ones were very explicitly secular academic spaces. And because I made a decision early on to consider Islamic studies in the context of religious studies, so Islamic studies as a secular academic discipline is situated in a complicated way, partly in religious studies, partly in area studies, and partly in other sort of adjacent fields, including some that are humanities fields. History comes to mind as well. But also others that are social sciences. So it occupies sort of a complicated space, which comes with a complicated set of ideas about toolboxes and theories. The part that is located in religious studies has in very particular ways been influenced by a apparently never-ending debate about religious studies as the secular academic study of religion that insistently, and this debate resurfaces, I think on a 7-year cycle. There's something biblical about that. It's a debate that often appears in binary. So it's a binary between analytical versus normative work, descriptive versus prescriptive. And within religious studies, interestingly, religion is treated as a unique challenge to policing the boundary between the two. I have in recent work, I'll say it like really out loud, since I got tenure in 2013, I have written more about this debate, specifically in Islamic studies, about normativity, about normative work, about work that makes prescriptive claims rather than providing descriptive or analytical work. And in those couple of articles, I have argued that we're overestimating religious normativity at the expense of recognizing that we all of us as scholars have other normative commitments, and that in religious studies, we have a tendency to elevate religious normativity as if it is completely qualitatively different from all the other normative commitments that we might have. And I see my own work, and in religious studies, this is an ongoing debate that is painful and complicated, as invested in the project of world changing. We have academic disciplines like ethnic studies, critical race studies, women and gender studies, where the idea that the knowledge that we produce is supposed to change the world is built into these fields. Religious studies is emphatically not one of those. And it is worth pointing out, because we now often talk about the secular academy as some type of space that is both protected and different from the rest of society. And I would want to argue here that, of course, the secular academy is a reflection of society. It's exhibiting its best and worst features just in a sort of smaller space. And what that means, among other things, is that sexism and racism affect academic spaces as much as they do everyone else. And I want to add, because of my work in Islamic studies, that there is a particular set of liberal forms of anti-Muslim hostility that have affected not only my work, but the work of other Muslim women scholars as well. And I mentioned sexism and racism, and I want to be very clear here. So I'm a white woman who is not obviously Muslim. I didn't change my name when I became Muslim. I don't wear hijab, and I'm very clearly white. So I definitely do not experience racism. I'm not someone who claims that being Muslim somehow racializes me. That's not, I think, how it works. But I have experienced the sexism that is inherent to the academy, as well as the peculiar treatment of myself as a Muslim as exceptional in very specific ways. And while I wouldn't describe my work as religiously prescriptive, I don't reinterpret the Quran. I don't rethink Islamic law in prescriptive terms. I don't reread the Hadith traditions. I do, as I said, think that my commitment to justice is a Muslim and Islamic commitment to justice. And I have, and that's an interesting twist on this story, actually spent quite a bit of my time writing about Muslim women scholars who do the prescriptive work that I just distanced myself from, right? So like I work on women scholars who've done work for gender justice explicitly from within Islamic frameworks. I want to say something about authority, because for me, that is one of the ways in which the challenges are expressing themselves. Islamic studies, not in unique ways, but in somewhat specific ways, have inherited the colonial, sexist, as well as racist frameworks of Orientalism. There's no question about that. I wish I could sort of have this conversation and be super nuanced. There's nothing nuanced about Orientalism. One of the ways in which I sort of think of it myself and the way I teach it is that Orientalist scholarship, as part of a broader academic structure, assigns white men the highest level of authority. Theirs is unquestioned. It's based on a detachment from their subject of research. It's apolitical, and it is supposedly objective. And with that in mind, it's possible to say very clearly that every aspect of a Muslim woman scholar's particular identity automatically decreases her authority as a scholar and as a teacher in the secular academy. And I want to point out here and also mention some names that it's clear to me after many years of watching this unfold and writing about it, that puts Black Muslim women in the most challenged position in terms of their religious authority. And there are reasons for why there are still so few Black Muslim women in Islamic studies. It's both what Kayla Wheeler has called a pipeline issue, but it is also a bigger problem of having their authority challenged literally every step of the way. That issue of authority, or the challenge to their authority, gets exacerbated for Muslim women scholars whose work focuses on gender and or sexuality. So just for the record, not all Muslim women scholars work on gender and sexuality. They work in all fields of Islamic studies. And I'm not saying that they all should work on gender and sexuality, but that exacerbates the exclusion and the marginalization. In secular academic spaces, we tend to be either dismissed as insignificant. That's true for most work on gender that sort of lives in particular spaces where if we do it, then no one else has to talk about it. Or it is fetishized in the service of liberal anti-Muslim hostility, in which certain types of Muslim feminist work is allowed, but from within a very patronizing framework of what the boundaries of that are. And that is what I think of as one aspect of liberal anti-Muslim hostility. I want to connect here to Muslim communities, and so far it all sounds like I'm complaining a lot. I promise there will be something else, but critique is important. Critique is the first step to making something better. So I'm not just complaining. And if I'm complaining on behalf of other Muslim women, not just myself. In some ways, I have been incredibly fortunate to be able to do the work I want to do in full employment. That's not true for everyone else either. So I want to recognize at this point in time that that's a certain type of privilege that also in turn puts me at less risk and makes these types of reflections possible in the first place. I want to make a connection here to Muslim community contexts that are complicated, and compare for a second how Muslim women scholars have been treated and received, if at all, by North American Muslim communities, and point out, for one, that male Muslim scholars traverse the boundaries between the secular academy and Muslim community spaces much more easily than women scholars do. And that has something to do with the issue of what kind of authority, what kind of scholarly authority, what kind of notion of expertise, but also what kind of religious authority women are assigned from Muslim community perspectives. I want to give a shout out here to work that Keisha Ali is currently doing and that she's given a couple of talks about that strikes me as interesting because has been looking at citational politics. So the ways in which scholars in Islamic studies in particular cite women scholars or don't so much, and where they do and how often they do. And it's interesting to me that in the work that I've seen so far, the book is in writing stages, and I've seen parts of it, and she has presented parts of it. It's interesting to me that some of the case studies, the examples that she uses to count citations are works by male Muslim scholars, not non-Muslim scholars. So there's an interesting dynamic happening here. And this perceived lack of authority that Muslim women supposedly have vis-a-vis Muslim community contexts is often couched in terms of lack of knowledge and lack of pedigree. I'm very curious to hear what Dr. Dhala's experiences are with that, because clearly that's not something she can be accused of. I have nothing to say to that accusation in particular, because it would require a complete reframing of where knowledge comes from, but I'm curious to hear what that might look like. And so there is a particular notion of Islamic knowledge that's being constructed here that my colleague Zarina Grewal has in her book, Islam as a Foreign Country, discussed in relation to gender, but also in relation to where sources of Islamic knowledge are imagined to be in the supposed Muslim world versus the North American context. I have argued in some of my work on Muslim feminist scholars that the degree of a Muslim woman scholar's authority does not only depend on her gender, but also on her actual approach, method, and interpretation. We do have Muslim women scholars who often don't identify as feminists, who are not rejected in the same ways. So gender is not the only marker that is connected to this question of authority here. One form of denial of authority that I have found really interesting to see unfold over the past decade is to simply ignore what we write altogether. So there isn't even a negative conversation or one that challenges Muslim women scholars. It's really just ignoring that we're doing anything. Added to that has been, especially in a sort of spillover into social media, increasingly vocal attacks against Muslim women scholars, where the descriptor feminism becomes an accusation and grounds for that type of attack. That's something I'm very, very concerned about. I don't think it helps intra-Muslim communal conversation at all to declare people to be outside of Islam because of the work that they're doing. And I want to sort of move to one piece that's a challenge, which is to think about, for the audience in particular, about, here we go. That was my timer, but I do need to say something more positive before I'm done. Who gets invited to speak in Muslim community contexts, right? Like, which women do you all think of when you want to talk about a particular topic? And I'm not even talking about all male panels on gender in Islam, which is sort of like the real excess of those types of problems. But I want to end with community building and with the fact that there is not just a host of problems that I outlined here, but also an increasingly global, but also localized network of Muslim women scholars of various generations that goes beyond masjid communities, that goes beyond the constraints of the academy, and that the work that we're doing, and this is my community, I think of that as my community, is to uplift and support Muslim women scholars, to cite each other and to engage each other's works, including critically. This is not it's not a solidarity fest where we're just all like, oh, you're all brilliant and I'm brilliant and we're all brilliant together, but we're engaging each other critically. And we're working very actively on mentoring and building community spaces. And I think of this as what sustains me as a scholar, which is a fiercely loving sisterhood. Real love is also about critical thinking together. And I see it modeling the kind of scholarship that I want to participate in, which is one that is capable of multiple critique and multiple arguments that are not mutually exclusive. And the very last thing I do want to say is that in the process of building these communities and these networks, and because I have studied activists for such a long time, I have also learned that what scholars do is not only sharing knowledge, but also recognizing that it is produced in many, many places, including in activist spaces. And so I have moved away in my own thinking from a model where scholars provide expertise and activists implement that expertise and turn it into practice, to rather think about the ways in which activists themselves produce knowledge from experience, and scholars are there to offer reflections from a vantage point that's different from the one that activists themselves often inhabit. So I think I want to end on that note. We have lots of work to do, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Dr. Dhala has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hammer. There were so many wonderful insights that you presented. The last piece that you were talking about in terms of the sort of perceived dichotomy between the scholar and the activist, I think really needs to be taken a look at. And I appreciate what you shared about sort of the mutual cross-pollination that can happen. And in some cases, an individual might be both scholar and activist, as I think many are. So thank you for giving us that food for thought. We'll turn over to Dr. Dhala and see how we can progress in this collective conversation. Dr. Dhala, welcome. The topic of your talk is Scholar Activists, Tracing the Tensions and Challenges in Centering Muslim Women's Voices in Scholarship Within the Islamic Tradition and Western Academia. Welcome.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ahli baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Good afternoon, salam, and greetings of peace to one and all. Thank you, Munir, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to which I think is a very constructive conversation that we're going to have today. My name is Mahjabeen Dhala, and I want to thank the Bayan and Berkeley, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Berkeley, and of course the Bayan Institute for having me and for hosting us. And thank you, Dr. Hammer, for sort of laying down much of the groundwork of what I think my talk, and I hope my talk will build on. So thank you very much for that insightful talk. I think it's befitting for me to just, in very brief sort of explain where I come from, what my background is. So as you said in the introduction forthright, I spent more than 20 years studying with and learning from Muslim women in different traditional seminary setups, and also as in community participation and community engaged learning setups. So I've had this fortunate opportunity to be able to travel across the globe, meet with women in the global north and the global south, sort of hear them talk about their concerns, and also see how so many times their religiosity becomes a point for them to initiate change and for them to engage with their challenges that they see in larger society. And that is what has informed my work. So my work explores female narratives in early Islamic history, in sacred literature, spirituality, law, practice, and of course, how that impacts the lived experiences of contemporary Muslim women. So as such, my work weaves in the study of classical Islamic texts and thought on one side, and then the kaleidoscope of emerging feminist thought. And I try to interrogate the undersupply specifically of biographical works on female activists in early Islamic history. As you shared, Munir, my PhD was on the Sermon of Fatima. And it is a 7th century and I argue marginalized Shia text, but it also documents the voice of a female theologian and an activist for women's inheritance rights and for social justice at large. So I make a conscious effort to highlight texts that indicate women's participation in scholarship and activism. I do this during my community presentations, and I also make it a point when I'm teaching in an academic environment. Now, I'm fortunate to be at the GTU, which is a thriving model of hybridity between theological as well as academic scholarship. It gives me the cutting edge of being able to engage with my students who bring their critical thought and their confessional ethics to the classroom. And the Center for Islamic Studies is a diversity hub where we study everything from classical Islamic texts, where we have scholarship on liberation theology, on Black Muslim experiences. And I think this is a plug there that we boast that we have about students from 20 different nationalities who speak and engage with 35 different languages across the Islamic tradition. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to be using an entry from a classical Rijal collection. Now, Ilm al-Rijal, and I'm taking a bold step here talking about this because, of course, we're being hosted by the Bayan Institute, and I'm sure this is everyday parlance for what they're studying there. But Ilm al-Rijal, as most of you know, is literally translated as the science of men. And it's a subset of hadith studies, where biographies of narrators are evaluated for the authenticity of a report. Now, the entry that I want to share with you will demonstrate a few topics, and I'm hoping that this is what will bring out the argument of what we're talking about today in this conference. So I'm going to ask the question, Ilm al-Rajal, it does actually record female narrators. So how Rijali is Ilm al-Rijal? And how appropriate is the term in the first place? B, I'm also going to be asking crucial questions about a specific woman's speech that was not thoroughly documented in this entry. And that'll still soon become obvious when I share that. And of course, lastly, the third main important point that I want to demonstrate through this presentation is that I will explore the idea of social activist from the perspective of Islamic studies and posit the discourse in the context of contemporary feminist scholarship in the academy to trace the tensions and challenges in centering women's voices. Now, I personally in my work have identified 3 challenges, major challenges: patriarchal, sectarian, and secular. And I'm going to use the case study of this entry to sort of elaborate on those challenges. Now, at this point, I'm going to share my screen so that I can show these slides to you. There is some Arabic text on, took a snapshot, the scanned book, a little bit about the book. And then I have few translations, not total translations of the text, just so that it can facilitate our conversation going ahead from the text. So the text that you're about to see is taken from Ikhtiyar Ma'rifat al-Rijal. This book was compiled by the early 11th century Islamic scholar by the name of Sheikh Tusi. Now, when I say Sheikh Tusi, it's Abu Ja'far Muhammad al-Tusi and not Nasiruddin Tusi. He's also known as Sheikh al-Ta'ifa. And this collection, which is Ikhtiyar Ma'rifat al-Rijal, collected by Sheikh al-Tusi, is also known by another name, and that's called Rijal al-Kashi, Muhammad ibn Umar al-Kashi. Now, he was the predecessor of Sheikh Tusi, and the popular notion is that the original work of al-Kashi was destroyed and Sheikh Tusi collected the remnants of the manuscript and put it together, while there are scholars who argue that no, this is the entire collection itself. Now, while we view this entry, I just want to clarify that the purpose of this presentation is not to be concerned with discussions on the authenticity of the hadith that you look at. That's not what we're focusing on. Rather, I want to focus on the female scholar activist voice within the entry. So if you bear with me, I'm going to share my screen so that we can all take a look at this. And Munir, I'm just looking for a thumbs up from you if this is visible. All right, that's great. So I've taught this hadith, or I've taken this up as a conversation in two different setups. So I've done it in community learning circles, and I've also done it as part of my Intro to Islam class, you know, in an academic setup. And the week where we talk about hadith studies, I will take something like this that, you know, the participants have an idea of what isnad is, what matan is when they're delving deeper into hadith studies. So this is what a typical hadith looks like when you do this kind of study. You have the chain of narrators. Sometimes within the brackets, there will be an assessment of whether the narrator is a thiqa, is reliable, or majhul, you know, maybe reliable, maybe not reliable. But this is how typically it will be presented. So I'm not going to go through this slide with, you know, with the names of narrators, just so that you have a reference of where this entry comes from. I'm going to go over to this next slide, which talks about the woman that I want to retrieve from this entry. Her name, difficult to find. It only appears here as Khalid. A corresponding entry in Usul al-Kafi names her as Abdiya. And now that's a different discussion as to why these women are not named. I mean, in the Quran itself, you have only one woman who is named, and that is Mary. And there are other narratives without naming these women. And that has its own complication. But I want us to sort of take some time and look at this narrative, this entry. Now it's entering an episode, which is roughly translated on the right of your screen. Abu Basir is the main narrator. The timeline is the 8th century. The location is probably the house of Imam Sadiq, the 6th Imam of the 12 Shi'i. We're not sure whether this is in Medina or this is in Iraq, but we know that there were two learning centers at that time in Medina and in Kufa. So we're not really sure what is the geographic location of this event. But the narrator proceeds and says, Abu Basir in this case, I was sitting with Imam Sadiq when Khalid, whose hand, now I've put this in a parenthesis because if you see the Arabic, it just says, you know, qata'a, doesn't really say what was cut off. She was just cut off. We don't know how, but I'll tell you why and from where I got this hand part. Had been cut off by Yusuf. And then there is an entry in the Arabic side as to who is this Yusuf. And this Yusuf is Ibn Umar, who was the wali or the governor of Iraq, who had assassinated Zayd ibn Ali in the beginning of the Zaydi movement and had later done this to Khalid as well. So when she entered and she wanted to seek permission to come and speak to Abu Abdullah in most hadith books is Imam Sadiq. And Imam Sadiq then turns to Abu Basir and says, Do you want me to facilitate your witnessing her speech? Would you like to listen to her speak? And Abu Basir says, yes. So there is another clause which I haven't translated here, which says, well, you can stay for as long as you can bear it, which sort of indicates that there's going to be an intense conversation that will ensue from here, right? He made me sit on the carpet, and then Khalid entered and spoke. I noticed that she was an eloquent woman. Now that's all that is said about what she said. She was an eloquent woman. She asked about Fulan and Fulan. Now in Arabic, Fulan and Fulan, when you do not want to disclose the name of a party that you're talking about, you say so-and-so, such and such. So she asked about two individuals. We don't know their genders, we don't know their names. And he said, so the Imam Sadiq answered her and said, do not befriend them. Now again, you'll see if you're reading the Arabic on the side, tuwallihima, which can be read in duality. Be their friend and also don't be their friend. Welcome to the wonderful work of learning Arabic and trying to understand ancient Arabic text, right? Or earlier Arabic text. But let's just park that for some time. He says, do not befriend them. She said, when I meet my Lord, I will state that you commanded me to stay away from them. And he said, yes, that's fine. You can do that. I take responsibility. And in the Arabic side, Abu Basir then goes on to say that she looked at me and she said, this man who's sitting on the carpet, he also tells me to stay away from them. But Kathir ibn Nawwa tells me to befriend them. And then whose opinion is better for you? And then Imam Sadiq returns and glorifies Abu Basir. He's such a nice person. Listen to what he says. And that discussion goes on. In the third slide is where I have just an explanation of where I took that the hand was cut off. And that's hadith number 4 here, which says Yusuf ibn Umar killed Zayd. He ruled over Iraq and cut the hand of Khalid. She was a righteous woman. So you get another character reference here. An eloquent woman in the previous hadith. And in this entry, Salihah, a righteous woman and a Shia. She was inclined towards Zayd ibn Ali. Now, I know this might be a lot for those who haven't had this exposure of looking at classical Islamic texts or retrieving entries from there. But I think it was very important for me to present this as a case study because I'm going to use this narrative now or use this entry now to highlight some of the objectives of this talk. So if I can very quickly, and I'm cognizant of my time, stay within the time, right? Like I said, I've used this in 2 different settings. I've done it in a community religious setting, and I've done it in my Intro to Islam class as well. And before I share the overlapping responses I received from the 2 different settings in which I presented this text, I want to address my first objective here. And that is how Rijali is Ilm al-Rijal, as in how much of man has to do with the science of men. Now, absolutely, among the 424 entries in the 3 volumes of this book, Ikhtiyar Ma'rifat al-Rijal, only 2 are women. Only 2 are women. So yes, it's a very slight marginal mention of women scholars in this book. But that's no mystery because the early records of Islamic history, like world history in general, is a record of men, documented by men. And if amidst the androcentric setup, traces of resilient female voices can be found, I argue that they must be retrieved and studied. Such study would provide us a significant glimpse of the worldview of women's engagement with scholarly and activist communities. The presence of these women's voices, however marginal, testify to their license and interest in participating and contributing towards public discourse and action. Patriarchal challenges that these women must have faced bring their narrative closer to the challenges faced by contemporary female religious and academic scholars. I want to uplift the traditional the traditional Islamic seminaries, in my experience, have awarded female students the privilege of studying classical texts and earning seminary degrees. I have one. But how many of these female graduates are later supported as religious leaders in their community? So that's my one question. How far away are we from patriarchy, even within the Islamic tradition or the Western academia, for that matter? The second objective that I want to raise from this presentation is to assert that women's experiences, as Dr. Hammer before me explained, are legitimate and authentic forms of knowledge production. To that effect, and in reference to this case study, I ask questions such as, why is it that Abu Basir does not give details of her speech while attentively and elaborately recording what Imam Sadiq says about him as a reliable student? Given the context of the 8th century Iraqi culture, if this did happen in Kufa, does it suffice to record, she spoke eloquently, in acknowledging a woman's excellence in a male-dominated scholarly community? While this text gives an indication of the shared space and opportunity for women and men to engage with a religious authority, and here I mean Imam Sadiq, who was considered a religious authority at that time, it maintains that the space is majorly taken up by the male reporter and what he chooses to elaborate in the report. Or if we were to set aside a gendered analysis of the report, could it be that the sectarian content of her discussion is what causes her remarks to be muted? Now, again, I draw your attention to the names of the people that she asked for that are not disclosed. Falan, Falan. The term tawallihima, has a dual explanation. Apparently it means befriend them. But then Sheikh Tusi in his commentary below says that no, he was saying do not befriend them. And to explain or sort of to evidence this meaning of tawallihima, Sheikh Tusi argues from the 33rd verse of the Surah An-Najm, where Allah says, you have this verse that says, أَفَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي تَوَلَّى. Have you not seen the one who turned away? So tawalla now is used in the Quran to mean turn away. So, he says what he's trying to say here is stay away. So the challenge presented by texts that are considered a sectarian taboo has pushed narratives of several early Muslim women further into the margins. The Sermon of Fatima, which was my dissertation, for example, is heavily contested for its provocative sectarian content. Now, this brings me to in fact, if I share, I'm trying to stay within my time, but if I share from my own personal experience, there have been places on this earth where I have been invited to speak about the sermon, and the event has been advertised as a coffee morning or an Avon makeup tutorial. But people are getting together there to talk about the Sermon of Fatima, just to talk about how charged it is in terms of sectarian content. Now, this brings me to the third and final objective, and I'm wrapping up here, that I aim to highlight in this presentation, and that is the notion of scholar activist in Islamic studies. The term that seeks to reconcile the identity of scholars as working in the proverbial ivory towers of academia and the identity of activists that strive for social change on the ground. Now, this dichotomy, and I'm glad that Professor Hammer, shed light on that there is a duality. And I argue that this duality or this dichotomy is derived from the mainstream Christian and secular Enlightenment thought. And there is no mystery, for the longest time, the Christian tradition held its monopoly in determining what constitutes knowledge and who gets to study it. The Enlightenment approach freed knowledge production from religious authority, but continued to maintain the hegemony of the elite scholar. So in the case of Islam, and this has been my basic argument throughout, even in my work, that the baseline for Islamic studies is so different from the baseline of secular or Christian studies. It really is very difficult to sort of align both methodologies and theories together. So in the case of Islam, its sacred text, that is the Quran, approves and incentivizes independent thought, exploration, experimentation, So a scholar in the Islamic context is a person who pursues all forms of knowledge, religious, mystical, physical, spiritual, without any specific stipulations for the need or function of clergy. The Islamic tradition mandates every scholar to act upon their knowledge to effectuate positive change in their given environments. Now, without laboring this point much, the example of the prophetic lifestyle itself is an embodiment of what a scholar activist model looks like. And I apply this to the case study of Khalid over here. Was she a scholar? Was she an activist? Was she a political activist? Was she supporting the minority that rose against the political power of her time, thus paying the price for it, her hand being cut off? This begs the question, was she writing for the Zaydi cause, thus offering us an incentive to investigate what written female scholarship looked like in the 8th century? Her narrative suggests that the existence of female scholar activists in the 8th century Iraqi society is very much a reality. Now, perhaps a recent example of such scholactivism might be inherent in the works of the 20th century Iraqi political activist Amina as-Sadr, who was assassinated for her stand for social justice. Now, in conclusion, I posit this discussion to the field of contemporary Islamic feminist scholarship. Now, my argument or my observation is that most of the scholarship in women's studies in Islam has been critical, which is fine, and it has been reactionary, perhaps in the light of the frame of 9/11, which sort of perceives the Muslim female or visible female Muslim subject as a sign of religious subjugation. And constantly, I think that scholars of Islamic studies, and specifically Muslim scholars of Islamic studies, are in a reactionary mode trying to educate the mainstream about what it is to be in a brown Muslim woman's body. Or sometimes I think, and I argue, that perhaps the current feminist thought in Islamic studies is following a prescriptive trajectory which has been built up, or a world or an order of knowledge that has been built up by white secular feminist thought. And its definition of what is liberal and what is progressive. So you find that in the academy today, there is a lot of support for liberal, progressive, Muslim feminist thought. And scholars that are working on retrieving biographical narratives of religious women in early Islamic history or in contemporary Muslim thought are considered as not critical enough. They're dismissed, as their scholarship is dismissed and goes unnoticed because it's not critical enough. And this is where I argue, and these are my final remarks, that I don't think Islamic studies or Muslim identity can ever be divorced from critical thinking. As Muslim bodies and as scholars of Islamic studies, critical thinking is an important feature of what we do and what we study. Yes, I mean, as a pushback to the Orientalist thought, yes, Muslims submit to an unseen God, but they are constantly debating on how they understand the nature of the divine. Muslims submit to the word of God as the final word of God, the Quran, but they're constantly critiquing the multiplicity of interpretations that arise from there. And they're constantly critiquing how that interpretation is then applied as Islamic law to Muslim life. Yes, Muslims testify to the prophethood of the last prophet, but they are constantly critiquing and debating what or how much of what he said or what is reported through him is authentic and how much of that is fabricated. So I don't think you can separate critical thought from being Muslim or engaging in Islamic studies. So there is no need to be overtly critical. And I think in the middle of all this, what is remiss is that the narratives of women like Khalid, the narratives of women like Fatima Zahra, the narratives of women who had memorized the Quran in the 8th century Fidda remained silent, remained buried. And I call for a constructive approach where we can reclaim and retrieve these voices, because I believe they have relevance to the lived experiences of Muslim women today. And that is where I find my scholarly work and activism sort of combining together. So thank you so much for giving me your time, and I look forward to your questions and further engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dhala. Appreciate your insights and your commentary about the nature of traditional scholarship and the critical approach to Islamic studies. One question that came to my mind, and we'll open it up. There are a few questions that have come in through the chat, but I thought I'd invite either of you or both of you to maybe say a little bit more about your own sort of theoretical approaches to the subjects that you study, not only the source material itself, whether they're classical texts or not, but just in terms of sort of disciplinary approaches. I think it could be helpful for the audience to get a better sense of how you navigate both in terms of, the fact that there has been a history of Orientalist approaches. Nonetheless, we live in this time in the 21st century where we have to take stock of prior scholarship and the deficiencies therein, and at the same time build and work within conversations that are going on in the field of religious studies. So I'd be curious to hear how you're navigating those matters. Dr. Juliana, would you like to go first? Yeah.
Sure. That's a great question. And my relatively short answer would be that, so I was trained in rather Orientalist Islamic studies in Germany, and made a decision relatively early on that I wanted to work on contemporary Muslim societies and communities. And what that has led to, in a somewhat meandering path for different books and different projects, is what I think of as mixed method. So I do textual analysis work. I have a very, very wide definition of what constitutes text. So it's everything from the Quran to Yasser Qadhi YouTube sermons and everything in between. But I have also, for some of my book projects, done ethnographic research. The type initially in Palestine that was sort of living in and then talking to people, and then for the domestic violence project, a very different kind of ethnographic research that involved interviews with advocates and participant observations in various contexts related to Muslim efforts against domestic abuse. And sometimes these conversations sound super basic. I've been an Islamic studies scholar for almost 30 years, and it's kind of frustrating to have to say, in Islamic studies, it is still the case that people who work on texts, and the earlier the better, the cutoff for real texts, sort of somewhat sarcastically speaking, is 1500, are seen as different kinds of scholars. There is a type of scholarly authenticity that comes with language training, which I have, for the record, and that comes with an idea about what texts can do for us. And that's not just an Islamic studies problem or an Orientalism problem. That's actually an issue in religious studies in general. There is a text focus. And as someone who trains graduate students, I find that it is really important to talk about what happens when you're not just an anthropologist and you're not just a text scholar, but you're trying to do both at the same time and bring them together. Because when I interview someone, the transcription of that interview turns into a text, and I analyze it in similar ways. So the methodology debate, I think, is a complicated one, but I also think that it retraces the line between Islamic scholarship and Islamic studies scholarship, because the work that I do is in Muslim community contexts, at least, often simply not recognized as scholarship at all. I remember vividly a conversation about 15 years ago in my own house with a group of Muslim professionals who I was involved in, where someone sat with us, with me and my partner, who is a historian of Muslim societies, and was lamenting that we don't have any real scholars in the community. And so there was this moment where I was like, excuse me? I mean, okay, so this is a very different definition of scholarship. And I wanna say, I can see why there is a need for a particular type of Islamic scholarship, right? The kind of work that engages with sources, that is looking, as Dr. Dhala has done, for inspiration, for a different telling of our own history. I would argue, though, especially in the context of the United States, Muslim communities also need to understand what's happening to them through the type of scholarship that myself and quite a few others engage in, right? Like, there is something to be learned from that, not instead of Islamic textual scholarship, but in conversation with it, which is the piece that doesn't happen, right? And not to be too cynical about it, but the focus on domestic violence, which for me was actually an entry point into those communal conversations, that's precisely what the book is about, has made it even more difficult to have that communal conversation. And this time it's not because my scholarship isn't real scholarship, but because no one wants to talk about domestic violence. And so there is this sort of freezing out of what is already uncomfortable. That also means that really important insights are really just ignored. To give you another example, it's not work that I do, but that others have done on Islamic education in the United States. Every time a masjid decides that they want to open Islamic school, they should be looking for the scholars that have done that work on the dynamics of Islamic education. What works and what doesn't? Why didn't it work? What are the complications? How do we define Islamic knowledge? That's not typically what they do. They don't even know that there is scholarship about that. And that, I think, is a problem. It's a real loss for Muslim communities to not recognize that that's work that's about them, but that's also really beneficial for them. And now my rant is over.
Thank you so much. No, it's certainly not a rant, but an important consideration for the community at large to realize that scholarship is going on and sort of documenting the different perspectives that are out there. And this is a valuable resource that we can benefit from for more self-reflection and maybe some course correction. Dr. Dhala?
Thank you, Munir, and I echo that. That was absolutely not ranting. It was precious. Thank you. So, and to sort of, echo what Dr. Hammer has just said, there is just no way out of interdisciplinary methodologies, when we're doing this kind of work. So my work is, historical textual analysis, that's what I do mainly. But then there's also post-colonial, decolonial thought over there, because I'm always confronted with the Orientalist view. There's pushback to that. There's pushback to the white feminist articulation of what is critical, what is constructive. So it sort of comes up in that. And also the anthropology or ethnocentric studies, that has it just blends in. There's no way of leaving this interdisciplinarity out from this kind of research. I remember most of my notes that I have been precious notes that have been gathered while I've been on trips and while I've posed these questions to different communities. So I was in UK for a couple of years back, and I met with a group of women who in the mosque community had sort of developed an entire vocabulary of British Sign Language, catered to Shia vocabulary to be able to provide a service to those who were denied. They were not able to, who were hearing impaired. And all their work, which was started maybe 2 centuries ago by an immigrant who came from Africa and settled in UK and who had children who were hearing impaired. And she started this whole movement with that developed so far in 2 decades, was not documented anywhere, was not studied, was not showcased, even by the community members. And in my intimate interviews with some of those members there, I learned that they were not even getting funding from their community to be able to expand this very necessary and useful work they were going. And this was just an example of how experiential knowledge is just pushed to the margins. It just stays buried forever and ever until somebody decides to talk about it or bring it out. And my question, being in the space that I am here in Western academia, is then this is not classy enough, in this kind of a white feminist setup. Because you don't talk about religious women, and you don't talk about women who are empowered by their religiosity. It's just disenchanting to do that kind of work. But I think it's still valuable. In terms of within the community itself, sharing the space, men and women, and the learning space, the access to religious authorities. This is something that it just came to mind while watching the clips just last week of the papal visit to Iraq. And I'm sure watching that room and seeing those things for all other pilgrims. I've had this good fortune of leading pilgrimages to Iraq. And I think there was one summer where we just led a whole group of women, female pilgrims to Iraq. And I was leading that group. And every time we go there to the office of Ayatollah Sistani, we insist that we get a one-on-one with him. And the summer that we had gone, he was just too tired to talk to us. And he sort of signaled his son, Muhammad Raza Sistani, to sit with us. And I remember we were a room full of maybe 50 women sitting down with him from different parts of the world, asking our questions. So my work has always been, what method I choose, how do I get that to be able to engage women, highlight their concerns, what are they feeling, what are their challenges, whether their voices are being heard in the authorities that are sitting and deriving, Islamic law that is going to impact their lives. So these are just different examples. And speaking to the point that, Dr. Hammer spoke about, it's what is considered authentic Islamic scholarship in our circles today, especially when it comes to Islamic education. I was involved for more than 8 years in developing a curriculum for Islamic education. And I think my tete-a-tete with most of those, how should I say, traditional thinkers was that the madrasa setup was looking towards the British system of knowledge, or that linear learning, or that compartmentalized learning, where you would have typically a course on Quran, a course on morality, a course on history, a course on jurisprudence. And I would always argue that this compartmentalization is not what is a signature of Islamic thought, because you wouldn't see the Prophet teaching people and saying, hey, now we're starting with our Quran class, so open up your Qurans. Or wait a minute, we're going to take a pause here, and now we're going to look into history. But it was a spiral growth. The pedagogy was a different pedagogy. And why is it, and this is where I question the colonial paradigm, why is it that we always need to authenticate our methods from the colonial methods or the hegemonic methods, Why can't we come up and make a radical change? And I did that radical change, and I was ousted for that kind of a radical change. And I find myself between tables here in academia as well, because I'm just too radical, I'm told, for the traditional table, and too religious for the secular feminist table. So I see that scholarship lost in the middle. You're in the room, but not on the table. And all this valuable scholarship, which I argue is very valuable and would lend itself to very loquacious conversations. There is so much academic and intellectual silence on all of this. So yes, the methodology has to be strategic and interdisciplinary. I think that's there's no other way, moving forward.
I think both of you are pointing to the fact that, the way we think of the canvas for intellectual work and scholarship is much broader than what we've inherited thus far, and the tools that we might have at our disposal are also of sort of multifarious nature. So thank you for those reminders and inspiration in your work for all of us to try to follow in those in that paradigm. So there is a question that I'll pose to, and I don't know if both of you would like to address this in your own way, dealing with the term patriarchy. To what degree is it valid to use modern terms like patriarchy with its current negative connotations in reading and understanding a different society, different in time and space? Isn't that a continuity of Orientalism? Who'd like to take a shot at that?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I don't mind taking a first stab at it. So I think the questioner here, thank you for your question, has really struck a nerve in me because for the most part of my work here in the Western Academy, I found myself translating all traditional Islamic knowledge into Christian theological terms. So when you raise this topic of using a term or reinforcing a term which is not necessarily an Islamic term, and that is patriarchy, I think that question is a larger question that goes across the board, because Islamic theology itself, can we translate Islamic studies with that word theology? Or is it more than theology? I mean, kalam, ilmul kalam, is kalam a method or a field? I mean, how do you sort of navigate that? Many a times I will be in my circles, doing my interfaith work, and people will sort of introduce my pastoral activities. And I will be like, but the term pastoral is very heavy. It's very Christian. It's a different term, but there is nothing else that is available to explain the work of a female religious leader, spiritual guide. What do you say? How do you put it? So it all just goes in a very neat box of pastoral activities, right? And how comfortable am I with that? Sometimes I ask myself, for every term that I come across, should I stop and investigate and interrogate and push back at that term? Will that leave me in a perennial loop of just fighting terms, or shall I just take, like we say, the language of the master to engage with the master's work, right? That is what we do as part of decolonial studies as well. We speak English. We come to American and European universities and we present indigenous ideas and we present indigenous methodologies. And in some ways we are sort of limited and we find ourselves obliged to use these kinds of terms. But of course, that has a totally different notion given the Islamic context, and a different notion how it is explained in Western academia. So yeah, that's a larger debate. Thank you for that question.
Dr.
Thank
Hammer?
you. Yeah, I am trying to see how to not make that a discussion about everything. But I want to embed the question of the term patriarchy in a broader question that actually also connects back with the earlier one about methodology, to say that I, as a scholar, I've arrived at a point where I'm no longer sure that in the contemporary moment, as Muslims who have experienced over several centuries colonialism in particular, and colonialism as one aspect of capitalism that seems really important to me as well, that modernity isn't just sort of a and then things change, but it is an economic system that changes and that has adjacent sort of things that come with it. That colonialism has done something to Muslim societies that make it, I think at this point in my life, impossible to recover what was before, because our vantage point on that before, on the pre-colonial period, on the pre-modern period, is one that is always filtered through our current situation, right? So recovering this recovery project, it seems to me in itself is actually a thoroughly modern project, and is at least in part a response to colonialism. It is in response to colonialism that Muslims define Islam as a religion and insist that the Quran is scripture. And it becomes harder and harder because nuance gets lost in that, because attached to Islam as a religion and the Quran as scripture is that Muslims are modern people and that Muslims can be modern. And so we can't step outside entirely, right? And I think that's where Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, which almost made me drop out of graduate school, is still really salient, because he describes it as an ideology, but he also says you can't step outside of it. We're stuck with this particular paradigm, and we can be critical of it, but even critical work, so like, for example, decolonial work is invested in the notion of colonialism as something that fundamentally changed everything. And it legitimates that discourse as well. The patriarchy piece is interesting to me, and I was sort of smirking a little bit when you read the question, because I actually keep encountering more now Muslims in particular who don't think of it as a negative term at all. So in the Peaceful Families book, I developed this notion of protective patriarchy, in which activists very intentionally and sometimes very strategically employ a notion of patriarchy, the rule of the fathers, the leadership of men as husbands and fathers, in order to offer protection to women and children. And when I teach in my public institution, and I teach a lot of stuff related to gender and to feminism, and I use the word patriarchy, and my students figure out really quickly that I do use it in a critical sense. But we often end up in a conversation early on in the semester about why this particular hierarchy bothers us so much. Is it that all social hierarchies bother us in that way? Is a hierarchy always inherently oppressive? And it's really fascinating to see this generation of students who are so much younger than me, thinking about hierarchies in relation to oppression and questions of equality, right? So is every hierarchy bad? It's really interesting. They often want to preserve some, right? Like some are, they're really invested, for example, which is kind of ironic, but they're very invested in the hierarchy of expertise, right? So the argument that we'll make is that you wouldn't want your surgeon to be like everybody else in a society and not know more about surgery because that expertise saves your life. So there's a hierarchy there, and that one's okay. Racial hierarchies clearly are not okay. Gender hierarchies are not okay, according to most of my students. And so that embeddedness, I think, is a really important question, right? Like, how is patriarchy intersecting with other hierarchical structures, and are hierarchical structures always inherently oppressive? And do we end up with some kind of imagined communism? I know Americans don't hear that word the same way I learned it when I was growing up in East Germany, but as something that equalizes everything, or does that just cause another kind of anxiety? So I think there are sort of really interesting dimensions to think about patriarchy as older than capitalism, but also as a particular hierarchy that gets exacerbated in particular ways in capitalist societies post 1500. And yes, to me, it's interesting that at least a certain contingent of people, and not only men, really, really important, women can be and often are as invested in patriarchal structures as men. It does us no service at all to divide society into women who resist patriarchy and men who support patriarchy. It's far more complicated because the power distribution isn't just between men and women. But I'm not sure, I don't know who asked the question, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily negative. And again, to sort of circle back around to where I started, we don't really have access to what people sometimes call sort of indigenous to Islam terminology. because it's refracted through our own knowledge systems. There is no unfettered access to an Arabic text. And arguably there never was, right? So like every interpreter of the Quran, even in 8th century scholar, was a product of their context to some degree, and couldn't just shed that and be a sort of blank page. The prophet may have been, that's how we understand his prophethood, but everyone else engaged through the context that shaped and formed them.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Amal, for asking the question. We have a few more minutes left for maybe one or two more questions. I have to extend my apologies to all of you who are on the webinar, and some of you have posed questions. I'm sorry that we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will take note of them and pass them along to the speakers for further thought and reflection. But the next question is from Zainab, and I think this kind of continues the conversation that you've both been taking up. How would you address the issue of Muslim progressive academics who rely heavily on Orientalist sources and clearly have no basic understanding of Islamic traditional scholarship beyond what is communicated by Orientalists and other progressives?
Yeah, I can sort of, chime in there. But I also want to start
the conundrum of sort of, advocating new lines of inquiry and thought, but then also sort of dovetailing back with Orientalist sources or approaches. Is that a correct characterization or perhaps not?
Well, I don't think that can be denied. There are traces of that in progressive scholarship, at least when it comes to progressive feminist thought. But I also wanted to sort of, link back to what Professor Hammer spoke about, the patriarchy and how sometimes it is perceived as something good, perhaps by some, Muslim women or some Muslim concepts or ideas. So I also want to sort of, complicate that with highlighting that this entire framing of Islamic patriarchy, or it's being presented as harsher than any other kind of patriarchy at large. Like I would also consider patriarchy within academic institutions today. There is a sign of that. And why is it that the burden is only on Muslim and especially Muslim women scholarship to be able to address or sort of push back against that kind of patriarchy? I mean, my daughters are scientists too, and they always come back telling me, Mom, this whole field is dominated by white male bodies, and to be brown and to be visibly Muslim just adds layers of jeopardy when you're trying to authenticate, your research and your knowledge. So so there is that, there is that as well. Is the burden totally on Muslim feminists or Islamic or Muslim female scholars to be able to arrest the understanding of patriarchy or redefine the understanding of patriarchy? But then this question that you asked about, progressive scholarship, it is apparent in so many, works that we see nowadays, where they are actually circling back to the Orientalist trope, and they're using a lot of that Orientalist language. And I think I'm confused as to, are they doing it? Again, I know that scholarship is valuable. I'm not trying to say that scholarship is not valuable, which is progressive, feminist thought. But my question has always been about how autonomous it has been from the Orientalist trope or the white secular feminist theory and that trope. So I would like to think of that question more as taking us towards a conversation of how autonomous our scholarship can be, independent it can be of that kind of a trope, and what would that methodology look like? And of course, for us to, given our spheres, diversify our methods as well. Because
it's good to be critical, it's good to be engaging in that kind, and it'll absolutely get you published, but will it also give you the diversity that exists between our methodologies? Can we also sort of make room for constructive methodologies? Can we make room for collaborative methodologies? Can we look and collaborate with other traditions and other disciplines and try to bring forth or center the work of women scholars today or women scholars in the past? So yeah, I don't know if I actually sort of address that question, but it is difficult to say if this is the only picture, but it's also very difficult to deny that this is not happening. It is happening, but is it the only thing that can be done given our situation today? Professor Hammer, perhaps you can enlighten us.
I would actually say that's also not the only thing that's happening. I find that as a sort of blanket, it sounds to me like accusation is actually really just a way to dismiss an entire body of scholarship. It's very easy to accuse a growing group of scholars. I didn't name any because in that second and third generation beyond early Muslim feminist scholars in the 90s, there are so many now that it's not possible anymore. And we're not all the same, and we often disagree with each other. And so leveling this accusation that we don't know the Islamic tradition, which is a cheap shot, right? So many of the scholars that do this kind of textual work, some identify as feminists, some identify with notions of gender justice because they think of that as a more indigenous term that draws on Quranic ideas of justice and extend that to gender as one of the aspects of justice. So I find it a little bit ironic for Muslim women scholars to tell other Muslim women scholars that what they're doing is Orientalist and invested in white feminism, when the work that Muslim feminists, self-identified Muslim feminists have done is much, much, much more nuanced. And many of them are scholars that primarily engage with texts and do know the textual tradition. I think there's a difference between not knowing the textual tradition and deciding that the textual tradition is so steeped in patriarchy that it cannot help us answer some of our questions. Those are not the same thing. And that's, I'm now speaking on behalf and about scholars other than myself. That's not been my work. But really just for the record, I could have done that work. I had the technical tools, the knowledge of Arabic. I learned classical Arabic when I was a graduate student. It's just not the choice that I made. And so I actually am someone who intellectually is interested in all the different possibilities. I want to be in conversation, and I appreciate, Mahjabeen, that that's where you went. I want to be in conversation with people whose scholarship is very different from mine. I don't go around telling people that they're not feminist enough, and that's why I won't read them or I won't talk to them. And I really wish that that sort of grace was extended in all directions. So Muslim feminists are not a blob, and we have frequent disagreements, however many or few there are of us. But I also think that that there is something to be said for the more the merrier, because we bring such different perspectives to the work that we're doing that I might find myself reaching even beyond other Muslim women scholars. I do want to engage Muslim men, including male scholars, in conversations, because I'm pretty sure that nothing's going to change if I don't. It's not a grace that's extended the other way around at all times, right? And so for me, like, one of the ways I have tried to describe this to my children, who are teenagers now, is that I want Muslim feminists to be considered part of the spectrum of scholarly conversations and possibilities within Islam. And often we don't even get that, right? Like we don't even get a space to say, well, what do you think? I mean, I could very easily accuse at least some Muslim male scholars I know of having the exact same idea about texts that Orientalists have. White male Orientalists and some of our Muslim male scholars have the exact same investment in textual positivism, texts somehow telling us a truth that we just need to uncover. And they don't think that's ironic. I think that's ironic, right? Like and that accusation doesn't take us anywhere. So I want to be careful, because both they don't know the Islamic texts or the Arabic, or they are influenced by Western ideas, are really just, it's too easy. It seems too easy to me to make that the grounds for dismissal of everything that this sort of unnamed group of scholars has ever come up with. One, and two, I also wonder if this Islam versus the West actually works. Historically, that's not a sustainable notion. There was no wall, because Americans love talking about walls. There was no wall between Europe and the Muslim world. It's a totally permeable boundary that isn't really drawn as a boundary until the 19th century in the case of Asia and Africa, right? Before that, it wasn't, the West was Europe. And it wasn't Euro-America either. And so I find this insistence on some type of Islamic purity versus Western pollution to really just not be borne out in intellectual history. We know that there were intellectual exchanges. We know that some Muslim debates were never just intra-Muslim debates. There were always other people around. And I mean, look at how much Muslim scholars love talking about Greek philosophy, right? Like, is that also the West? Is Greek philosophy not okay anymore? Can we not think with that, even though we know that medieval Muslim thinkers did think with Greek philosophy? So is that not pure? I don't get anything out of this idea that there is sort of a distinction and that there's a boundary, nor do I have any investment in policing the boundary between those two.
I just wanted to sort of, just sort of add that when I heard that question, I didn't really think of that question in an accusatory tone. I thought it was more a question on diversity, and that's how I addressed it. So it's more about what is focused and what is left out. So I know that, that grace that you speak about, Dr. Hammer, that is so important. And of course, I want to highlight what you said, that not all Muslim women's scholarship has to be gender related, for it to be authentic scholarship. Muslim women can have scholarship in different fields and yet be authentic, knowledge producers. So I think I was addressing that, and I want to clarify that I was addressing that more as a diversity rather than to foster diversity, and of course sharing that the grace that you extended, that's so commendable. But I wonder, how much privilege is in there. I mean, being in privileged positions to extend grace, and then to be in an underprivileged position where you're not heard or not authenticated, how much grace can you sort of give back? So I think there are different, layers of complexities as we unfold and unpack these terms: feminist, indigenous scholarship, original textual work, what constitutes a text, and all that, I think, just lends to the diversity, which I argue should really flourish and thrive, given this so-called liberated atmosphere that we are in. So that is where I was going with the question. So just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you both for giving us sort of a deconstruction of patriarchy and how it might be implicated in the scholarly work. There's one last question for both of you. How do you make your work more accessible Academic writing and conceptual frameworks can be very specialized and technical, but how might you rewrite your scholarly work for public discussions? This, of course, webinar is an example of an attempt to do that, but perhaps you have more to say on this.
So this is actually not a difficult one to answer for me, in the sense that I have found over the years, so Peaceful Families is my third book in English, and I wrote it and the book before on woman-led prayer explicitly with my own undergraduate students in mind, which is a really interesting experience, to think of undergrad students as the public, and a sort of cross-section of the public. I would like to think that my writing generally is eminently accessible and readable. So on the level of how I write, accessibility has always been really important to me. There's a very extensive conversation about the way in which particular types of academic jargon also exclude activists from conversation, which is the second reason for why that is not how I want to write. I assure you, I have colleagues in religious studies who think I don't know any theory because I don't do jargony, complicated, half-page paragraphs. So that's one aspect of it. The second one, and that's more complicated, has to do with how to actually get our scholarship and our ideas to a wider audience. And again, I don't think there's a wall around academia. It hasn't worked like that in a long time. Many of us write blog posts and stuff that's accessible online. The pandemic, if it had any positive aspects to it, has made recorded conversations like these available to many, many more people, and has made webinars much more broadly accessible. But I will also say this next book project that I'm working on, I have seriously considered writing it as a series of blog posts and just putting it on a website, because I can't. I don't have to publish for professional purposes. I've done a lot of writing and a lot of publishing. And I think about this often, this question of how can we get our ideas to people who are interested, but who are either not having access to our sort of printed publications that cost money, or may acknowledge that accessing books, even the best and most influential ones, isn't possible for everyone. And there is do you have time to read an entire book? It's definitely not as exciting as a mystery novel. So, I mean, our work is exciting, but not that exciting, right? So like, it's harder to read. And so I have wondered about this. And so I want to flag something that I just sort of recently did, and mine's not out yet, but Dr. Sarah Omar at Georgetown University has produced these really wonderful 15-minute videos with particular scholars that students often read, where she basically just asks them, like, what is your work about? How has it changed over time? And how did you get to where you are now? And I love these. I love this idea of having shorter pieces to listen to watch in this particular case. I still don't know how to record a podcast, but I know how to listen to one. And so I actually think this is a responsibility that we have. It's a responsibility that we have precisely because, as I said earlier, if we want to change something, we need to be very clear about where that change might take place. And so it's something I think about regularly. I, as you can tell, am rather on the wordy side. And so writing a 1,500-word blog post is very painful because it's very short, but it also feels like something that I would like to invest more into. And that also requires perhaps, and that's why I think this type of conversation is really great, it requires institution building. I think we need institutional spaces where that can happen so that it doesn't just become my own overtime, right? So that it becomes something that is actually valued. And here again, and I appreciate that Dr. Dhala sort of reached back to me about it, the more the merrier. I don't want those spaces to be exclusively one or the other thing. I don't need it to be a space where that's an echo chamber because we're already all talking about the same things in the same ways. I want the conversation. I want the disagreement. I think I actually am convinced that Islam has survived for such a long time with the onslaught of colonialism because we have vehemently disagreed about stuff, which has kept us going, right? So like a static religious tradition wouldn't have survived in that way. It's the movement. And the Quran is all about change. It's all about not staying the same. And so I would love for that to sort of get farther out and to more places. I don't think more intellectual nuance to the nth degree and specialization is actually the way forward for us, at least not for me.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Hammer. As I was listening to you, you know, I of course resonate with what you said, but I think that question about how to make your scholarship accessible, or to what extent, you know, is it academic scholarship? Is it reaching the masses? And Munir, as you pointed out, that, you know, opportunities like this one, this conference, it sort of helps us to merge and bring that academic research and conversation with the public, and connect it to the lived experiences of people on the ground. But I think that, you know, to answer that question, you need a sort of a privileged location yourself. So you've, you know, Professor Hammer, you're done, you have your tenure, and you can say just anything you want to say, you know. It can be done in print, it can be done, you know, you can vocalize it, and you can say it. So I think a lot has to do, in the context of sort of addressing that question, a lot has to do with your own location, the location of the scholar, you know, and the privilege or the stability, sort of continuity that is enjoyed by the scholar. And at the same time, I think I find that I feel blessed almost to be in that kind of a situation where what I do with my community enriches me, and it enriches my scholarship that I do in academia, and the different kinds of theories and methodologies that I engage with in my academic study also helps me shape how I disseminate that within the community as well. So I actually see this as a vantage point, you know, to be able to be a scholar practitioner, if you like, or, you know, trying to bring both those communities in conversation with each other. Now, again, given my situation at the GTU, I'm blessed to have these kinds of community engaged scholarship. We were recently granted the Luce Foundation grant to sort of uplift voices of Brown and Black communities who were providing, you know, COVID relief at the grassroots level. And that sort of brought us and our students directly in engagement with communities that were doing this job of leadership. So I think being at the GTU again gives me that edge where I can blend both communities together and share resources from each community into the other. Given my situation in the community itself, I think I've traveled widely trying to, you know, shed light, disseminate new ways of looking at our culture, our practice, at what we do liturgically, and what that means in critical thinking, and how we can sort of nuance it to uplift female religious scholarship, you know, take women's concerns to higher authorities. So I think it's given me that opportunity to make myself and my work accessible even to the public arena. The pilgrimage work that I do, and during the pandemic, you're right, you know, and it's part of feminist theory to be able to privilege the work of the author and not really resort to consumerist reading, you know. So in my women's studies and religion class, I make it a point not to assign maybe 200 pages of reading a week, rather concentrate
on the voice of the scholar and delve deeper into the methods of the scholar than just give 200 pages and, come and then engage in a seminar. So I think that is also part of feminist pedagogy, to sort of privilege the author and take the time to read the author. And it doesn't have to be the written word, those 15-minute clips. I remember we did Foucault and just a little, clip on what his work is to sort of start getting us into the conversation. So of course, all those are legitimate and authentic modes of engaging with the communities, I think. And in my own personal work, I think given the pandemic, I've started posting clips on YouTube. I've started, sharing my public presentations. I did something for the MLK Day in San Francisco and putting it out there so people can access it. I wonder if there is a monopoly to knowledge. There isn't. And I think our pride as scholars is to find ourselves as conductors of that energy, from the sources that we receive, and then we mold it and make it user-friendly to be able to pass it forward to where it matters. So, this I think is important work. We incorporate that in our courses. We're teaching a course on COVID-19 and precarious life this semester, and we're able to bring all these community voices and again take voices. And I think at the same time, the caveat is that we respect the spaces of the communities and the public, because I'm just saying this because sometimes it can be quite counterintuitive if a white feminist approaches a Black community to educate them and to sort of equip them with how they are supposed to, engage with their concerns and find answers to their concern. So while we're engaging with the public, I think that caveat is also very important as to how we maintain that respect, if not a wall, but at least that respect and acknowledgement of where we come from, and we appreciate the knowledge that has been produced by the community itself, instead of appearing to be as emancipators or educators of people in their community. And I think that's also important to be mindful of.
Thank you so much, both of you, Dr. Hammer, Dr. Dhala. This has been a fantastic program, and you've really given us a lot of food for thought, and we so appreciate your participation. I'm going to just let the audience know that we do have another upcoming program this month on the 26th of March at 10 a.m. Pacific time, so slightly different timing, with eminent scholar Dr. Syed Hussein Nasser. So if you're interested in that, please do register in advance. The URL is there, bit.ly/Nasser program, and we'll have an opportunity to hear from one of the eminent scholars in Islamic Studies. So we look forward to seeing you from time to time as we roll out more programs in collaboration with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Thank you again, everyone, for being here this afternoon. Farewell, and we'll see you soon. Take care.